In this video, we're just going to talk about some of the algebra they talk about on page 252 in the textbook. So they start with this sum, and this will be useful for us later. We'll see we're going to need a formula. So we start with this sum, and it's pretty similar to the one that we did on page 243, but this one we've got negative exponents. So x to the negative 1. Remember, you could think of this as 1 over x to the first, 1 over x squared if you don't like using negative exponents. So this is the equivalent of what we're looking at. But we're going to embrace the negative exponents, and what they want us to do is factor out an x to the negative n. Now, usually when we factor out something, we actually see that term in every single factor, but this is going to be a little bit unusual. So what we're going to be doing is taking advantage of this fact that if you have x to some power m times x to some power, let's call it p, then we're left with x to the m plus p, right? This is the fact we're going to be using, but we're sort of doing it in reverse. What we want to do is factor this x to the negative n out. So I'm going to write it over on this side, even though the book does it on the other side, just so you can see what's happening. So I want to really be thinking to myself, what could I be multiplying x to the negative n by, right? If I were to sort of distribute this back out to get back to the original. So this last term is the easiest. I see that this has to just be a 1, because if I multiply 1 times x to the negative n, I'm left with x to the negative n. Okay. The rest of these terms, we're going to have to think a little bit more carefully about what's happening. But let's look at if this is x to the negative n minus 1, right? So this is kind of like x to the negative n plus 1 if I distribute this negative sign here. So if I multiply this by x, that's going to actually give me the same thing as this original term, right? So this term, let me erase something for a second. Let me just move this space. I need it for a second. Okay, so this term right here I could think of as x to the negative n plus 1 if I distribute that negative, right? So how can I write x to the negative n plus 1 as x to the negative 1 times something? Well, if I do x to the negative n times x to the 1 using this property here, I would be adding their exponents to get what I started with. So notice that if I factor out x to the negative n, this is equivalent to this second term here. So let me use a little color here. So this term is equal to this times this. And we want to just continue filling in these parentheses here like they did in the book, but I'm just trying to give a little bit more meaning to these. So we keep going. And so the same kind of process is going to happen here. That if I multiply this by x to the n minus 3 times x to the n, negative n, I'm sorry. So this will be equal to this times this, because x to the n minus 3 times x to the negative n is the same thing as x to the n minus 3 plus negative n, which is x to the negative 3, right? So again, we're using this property over here. Okay, so x to the n minus 3 times x to the negative n will be giving us x to the negative third. So hopefully you followed that. And likewise, this one would be x to the n minus 2, and this one would be x to the n minus 1. Okay, so hopefully you followed that. And now what we should recognize is that this part right here is exactly this term over here that we found on page 243. So we can replace that parentheses with what it's equal to. This is equal to x to the n minus 1 over x minus 1, but then we still have this times x to the negative n. Okay, now what they do in the book is they say, okay, let's distribute this x to the negative n back in. Okay, so we're kind of factored it out and then we're distributing it back in, which feels weird but we're going to see it's actually going to help us, because x to the negative n times x to the n, when we add those exponents, we're going to get x to the 0 minus, when I distribute x to the negative n all over x minus 1. And that's the same thing as x to the 0 is 1 minus x to the negative n all over x minus 1. So this is the end result, and this is what you need to write down in your workbook. And hopefully that explanation was as clear as it can be, and hopefully more clear than what you saw in the book.